The air was a sterile hum, a constant low-frequency vibration that settled in the marrow of his bones. Unit 0734, designated alien by the sanitarians in their moments of what passed for kindness, knew this sound better than a heartbeat. He had never heard his own. The biomonitors did that for him, translating the frantic flutter in his chest into a serene green line on a distant screen. Here, in the chrome-white cell of the sanctuary, silence was not an absence of noise, but a carefully manufactured presence. It was the sound of control. He sat on the edge of the therm gel bed, the fabric of his standard-issue tunic a smooth, frictionless plane against his skin. Everything was smooth. The walls, the floor, the single table fused into the corner. There were no edges here, no textures to catch on, nothing to remind the body it was a thing of substance, of flesh and friction. His world was a sensory deprivation chamber, designed to purify, to nullify, to erase instinct. He was not a person. He was an asset. The words were a catechism, drilled into him by soft, synthesized voices during his sleep cycles. An asset is stable. An asset is compliant. An asset does not feel. It performs. Yet a tremor had taken root deep in his abdomen, a low, coiling heat that had nothing to do with the room's regulated temperature. For 3 cycles it had been growing, a secret, shameful bloom of warmth in the cold storage of his body. His scent, normally a meticulously suppressed whisper of ozone and cool water, was threatening to thicken, to sweeten into something dangerously organic, something real. He pressed his palms flat against the bed, anchoring himself to the placid cool of the gel. He was a vessel, pure and empty. He could not afford to be anything else. A flicker, the overhead light panel, a perfect, shadowless square of synthetic daylight, wavered for a nanosecond. The hum of the air recyclers hitched, a stutter in the sanctuary's perfect rhythm. Elian's head lifted, his eyes, the pale grey of a storm-clouded sea, fixed on the seamless door. Such a thing had never happened. The sanctuary was infallible. Its systems were absolute. The tremor in his gut tightened into a knot of cold dread. The green line on a screen somewhere must be spiking. Another flicker, longer this time. A low, resonant thrum vibrated up through the floor, a deep-chested groan from the facility's core. Then, chaos. A siren, shrill and piercing, shattered the manufactured silence. It was a sound he had only ever heard in simulations, a theoretical sound for a theoretical failure. Red light bled from the seams of the walls, bathing the chrome-white room in the color of panic. The synthesized voice that usually lulled him with doctrine now screamed a single, clipped word. Compromise, compromise, containment failure in Sector Gamma. Elian flinched, curling inward. His hands flew to his ears, a useless gesture against a sound that felt like it was inside his skull. The carefully constructed walls of his conditioning began to crack. The heat in his core surged, a tidal wave of pure, undiluted instinct. Fear. It had a scent. He could smell it on himself, sharp and electric, mingling with the forbidden sweetness that was unfurling from his pores. He was malfunctioning. He was failing. He was becoming. The door hissed open, not with its usual silent grace, but with a jarring, metallic shriek. 2 figures stood silhouetted against the blood-red emergency lighting of the corridor. Sanitarians in their sterile white armor, their faces obscured by reflective visors. But it was the man between them who held the room, who held the very air in a state of suspended animation. He was tall, dressed not in white, but in the severe, unforgiving black of a director. His uniform was immaculate, the lines sharp enough to cut. He moved with a chilling economy of motion, stepping into the cell as if he were stepping into a boardroom. He was the architect of this silence, the embodiment of its control. Director Kalen. Elian had seen him only a handful of times, always through reinforced plasteel, a distant, authoritative presence observing his progress. To see him here, in the flesh, was like seeing a law of physics walk into a room. Kalen's face was a study in controlled severity, all sharp angles and disciplined planes. His eyes, the color of polished steel, swept over Elian, an assessment devoid of emotion. They noted the tremor in his hands, the wide, terrified grey of his eyes, the faint, shimmering haze of scent that now clung to him. The scent of an Omega in distress, a priceless, volatile asset on the verge of total system failure. Status. Kalen's voice was low and steady, cutting through the wail of the siren. It was not a question. It was a command for reality to report itself. Preheat cycle accelerated by system shock, Director. One of the sanitarians reported, his voice tight. Scent signature is escalating. We can't neutralize it in time. The evacuation protocols are clear. Unstable assets are to be purged. Purged. The word was a sterile void. Elian felt the blood drain from his face. He was not an asset. He was an experiment. And the experiment was over. He looked at Kalen, the man who was both his creator and his judge. There was nothing in that gaze. No pity, no malice. Just the cold, clear light of brutal pragmatism. The sanitarians raised their pulse rifles. The low hum of their weapons charging was the last sound he would ever hear. He closed his eyes. "Stand down," Kalen commanded. The hum ceased. Elian's eyes snapped open. The director took another step forward, his gaze locked on Elian. The air grew thick, heavy, with an invisible pressure that made Elian's lungs ache. Kalen was an alpha. Elian had known this in an academic sense, a file in his mind. But he had never felt it. Now, it was a physical force, a gravity that pinned him in place. The Tor. "Asset is too valuable to purge," Kalen stated, his voice a flat line. "The primary directive is preservation. I'm invoking Executive Protocol 7. The sanitarians shifted, their body language radiating confusion. "Director, Protocol 7 requires a full claim. It's a permanent biological measure. For an asset this pure. It is a measure to ensure stability and control." Kalen cut him off, his eyes never leaving Elian's. "His scent will be shielded by mine. He will be rendered invisible to scavenging alphas in the chaos. He will be tied to me, and therefore he will be controllable." He spoke as if Elian were a faulty piece of equipment requiring a manual override. He began to unfasten the high, severe collar of his uniform. As he moved closer, his own scent, which had been a tightly controlled aura of cold steel and winter air, began to expand. It was not aggressive, but it was absolute. It stripped the air of Elian's fear, replacing it with an overwhelming sense of authority, of inevitability. Elian scrambled backward on the bed until his back hit the cold wall. This was not in any simulation. This was a violation of the highest order, a contamination of the purity they had spent his entire existence cultivating. A claim was a primal, messy, emotional act. It was everything the sanctuary was built to eliminate. Kalen reached him. He did not touch him with his hands. He simply leaned in, his presence a crushing weight. The scent of him was everywhere now, a clean, sharp, terrifying scent that promised order and obliteration in equal measure. Elian's breath hitched, his body caught between the instinct to flee and the instinct to submit. There was nowhere to run. Kaelin's jaw was tight, his movements precise, clinical. He lowered his head, his lips parting slightly. Elian could see the faint, sharp glint of his canines. This was not an act of passion. It was a surgical procedure, a branding. He braced for pain, for the tearing of flesh he'd read about in forbidden biological texts. Kaelin's mouth closed over the scent gland at the juncture of his neck and shoulder. There was no pain, only a sudden, sharp pressure, and then a flood. A tidal wave of pure, undiluted alpha intent crashed through him, rewriting his biology in a single, brutal moment. It was a psychic shockwave that blanked out the sirens, the red lights, his own name. In that instant, he was not Unit 0734. He was not Elian. He was his. A silent, screaming brand of ownership was seared into his soul, a circuit completed, a switch thrown. The world went dark. He was not purged. He was possessed. Kaelin felt the moment the bond snapped into place. It was a clean, visceral shock, like a high-voltage current grounding through his own nervous system. He felt the Omega's terror, a frantic, bird-like panic that beat against the inside of his skull. And then he felt it. Muted, subsumed. The wild, sweet scent of blossoming distress was instantly smothered by his own, overwritten as if by a superior code. The air cleared. The asset was stable. Protocol 7 was a success. He lifted his head, a single, perfect drop of blood beading on his lower lip where his teeth had broken the skin. He tasted ozone, salt, and a fragile, devastating sweetness that sent an unwelcome tremor through his disciplined body. He ignored it. This was a tactical necessity, not a surrender to instinct. The Omega, Elian, had slumped against the wall, his eyes wide and unfocused, pupils blown. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a stunned, pliant stillness. The psychic backlash of the claim was severe, especially on a subject with no prior exposure. It was a mercy. A conscious asset would have been problematic. Kaelin straightened his collar, the small act of order a reassurance in the surrounding chaos. The sirens still blared, the red lights still pulsed. Distant, muffled concussions vibrated through the structure. The sanctuary was falling. "Package is secure," Kaelin said, his voice clipped. He looked at the two sanitarians who stood frozen, their posture a mixture of awe and revulsion. They had just witnessed their director, the paragon of sterile control, perform the most primal act an alpha could. "We are evacuating now." He bent, sliding one arm under the Omega's knees and the other behind his back. The body was light, almost frail, all sharp angles and delicate bone structure beneath the thin tunic. He was a creature made of glass, and Kaelin had just etched his name into him. The contact was jarring. The warmth of the Omega's skin seeped through the layers of his uniform, a foreign heat against his own cool, regulated temperature. He adjusted his grip, making the contact as minimal, as functional as possible. He was carrying a piece of sensitive equipment, nothing more. He moved out into the corridor. The scene was one of controlled pandemonium. Sanitarians and personnel in grey jumpsuits moved with urgent, panicked efficiency. Data slates were being wiped, samples were being incinerated, evidence was being erased. The purge was not just for unstable assets, it was for the entire facility. Whatever had breached their security, it was a threat that required the complete erasure of Project Chimera. He was saving its most successful result, The logic was sound. His actions were justified. Yet the dead weight in his arms felt less like an asset and more like an accusation. They moved through the labyrinthine corridors, a blur of red light and shrieking alarms. Kalen's presence cleared a path. Alphas, even the disciplined ones in the sanctuary's employ, instinctively shied away from the potent, possessive scent rolling off him. It was a declaration of ownership so absolute it bordered on obscene in this environment. He was a walking violation of their core tenets, yet he was also their director. The contradiction held them at bay. He could feel their eyes on him, on the paled, unconscious form in his arms. He ignored them. Their opinions were irrelevant data points. The weight of the Omega's head lolled against his shoulder. A faint, clean scent, now tinged with his own, rose from the boy's hair. It was a scent like clean linen and rain-washed stone, a scent that had no place in this world of recycled air and antiseptic solution. It was a scent of something real, a distraction. Kalen focused on the exit sign at the end of the long causeway, the primary extraction point. His transport was waiting. He could feel the faintest echo of the Omega's consciousness through the new bond, a confused, frightened whisper in the back of his mind. It was like listening to a conversation in another room, muffled and indistinct. He had studied the theory of claiming bonds, of course, a neurochemical and pheromonal link, a feedback loop designed for protection and procreation, a primitive biological relic. To experience it was disorienting. It was a new variable in a life dedicated to eliminating them, a loose thread in a perfectly woven tapestry. He would deal with it. Once the asset was secure, in a new, controlled environment, the bond's influence could be analyzed, mitigated, and managed. They reached the transport bay. The massive armored doors were open to a night sky choked with smoke and the orange glow of distant fires. The air that rushed in was cold and sharp, thick with the smell of burning composites and something else. Damp earth. Rain. Elian had never smelled rain. The sensory input, even filtered through the Omega's unconsciousness, was a dull shock. Kalen carried him up the ramp of a sleek, black, atmospheric shuttle. The interior was minimalist, cold, functional. His personal transport, his sanctuary. He laid the Omega down on one of the crash couches, the movement careful, precise. He secured the restraints, his fingers brushing against the warm, soft skin of the boy's arm. The contact sent another, unwanted jolt through him. He retracted his hand as if burned. He was not an alpha succumbing to instinct. He was a director preserving an asset. He repeated the words to himself as the shuttle's ramp closed, sealing them in. The roar of the engines drowned out the sirens. The vessel lifted, a smooth, powerful ascent that left the dying sanctuary behind. Kalen took his seat opposite the couch, his posture rigid, his hands resting on his knees. He watched the still form of the Omega, the gentle rise and fall of his chest. The boy's face, in the cool blue light of the cabin, was serene, a blank slate. But Kalen knew it was not blank. He had signed his name on it. He had claimed him to save him from the system. But the system was Kalen himself. And now the asset was with him, bound to him, a living, breathing paradox he refused to acknowledge. He had contained the problem. He had not, however, anticipated that the container itself might be compromised. The shuttle broke through the cloud cover, leaving the chaos below for the cold, clean dark above. But the chaos was not below. It was in the cabin with him, sleeping on a crash couch, and it was beginning to take root inside his own meticulously ordered mind. The first sensation was sound, not the sterile, omnipresent hum of the sanctuary, but a deeper, more complex tapestry of noise, the soft, rhythmic rush of circulated air, the distant, muffled roar of city traffic, a low, electronic thrum from the walls themselves. Elian's consciousness drifted up from a deep, black well, snagging on these new textures of sound. Then came scent. Not the null scent of his cell, but a symphony of unfamiliar molecules. The cold, clean scent of polished metal and glass, the faint, sharp smell of ozone from electronics, and under it all, woven through everything like a steel thread, was the scent of him. The Alpha, Kalen. It was a scent of winter air and authority, and it was everywhere. It was in the air he was breathing, on the clothes he was wearing, and, he realized with a sickening jolt, it was coming from his own skin. The brand on his neck pulsed with a dull, phantom ache, a constant reminder of his new reality. He was marked. He was owned. He opened his eyes. The light was soft, indirect, a cool grey that mimicked a dawn he had never witnessed. He was lying on a surface that was both soft and firm, covered by a sheet of fabric that was impossibly smooth against his skin. He pushed himself up slowly, his muscles feeling weak and disconnected. He was in a room, a large, spacious room with walls the color of slate and a floor of dark, polished wood. One entire wall was a sheet of transparent plasteel, a window overlooking a breathtaking, terrifying vista. A city. Towers of glass and steel pierced a sky bruised with the colors of twilight. Lights glittered like a fallen constellation, and streams of vehicles flowed like rivers of light through deep canyons between the buildings. It was too much, too big, too vast. He had only ever seen images, simulations. The reality of it was a physical blow, a sensory assault that made his head spin. He tore his gaze away, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked down at himself. He was no longer in his white tunic. He was wearing a simple, soft grey shirt and trousers. The fabric was light, clinging to his form. It felt personal, intimate. He scrambled off the bed, his bare feet meeting the shocking cold of the wood floor. He stood in the center of the room, a small, lost thing in a vast, minimalist space. The room was Kalen's, an extension of the man himself. It was ordered, precise, and emotionally sterile. A large bed, a single black console, a closed door. There were no personal effects, no clutter, no color. It was a space designed for function, not life. And yet, it felt more real, more solid than the entirety of the sanctuary. The door slid open with a soft hiss. Kalen stood there, a dark silhouette, against the brighter light of the outer room. He had changed out of his uniform and was now in a simple black shirt and trousers that mirrored Elian's grey ones. The effect was unsettling, a subtle marking of them as a pair. His face was as unreadable as ever, his steel-grey eyes assessing Elian's state. "You are awake," he stated. It was not a question. The transport was turbulent. The sedative was necessary. Elian flinched back, wrapping his arms around himself. A sedative. He had been drugged, transported, and redressed like an object, an asset. The catechism echoed in his mind, but it sounded hollow now. He was not just an asset. He was a claimed Omega, a new, more complicated designation. Where is this? Elian's voice was a raw whisper, unused to forming questions. "My residence," Kalen replied, his tone flat. He stepped into the room, and the space seemed to shrink around him. His presence was a physical weight, his scent a constant pressure. You are safe here. The sanctuary has been decommissioned. The project is terminated, decommissioned, purged, cold, clinical words for destruction and death. He thought of the sanitarians, the other units. Were there others like him? Had they all been purged? The thought was a shard of ice in his gut. The others? Kalen's expression did not change, but a flicker of something, discomfort, regret, passed through his eyes. So quick, Elian thought he might have imagined it. There were no others of your generation. You were the final iteration, the only viable result, the only one. The words should have been a comfort, but they felt like a curse. A unique specimen, too valuable to destroy. He was alone, utterly. He looked at Kalen, the man who had saved him from one cage only to place him in another. This room was larger than his cell. The view was infinite, but the bars were just as real. They were forged from the bond that hummed between them, an invisible leash that tied Elian's very biology to this cold, controlled alpha. Why? Elian asked, the word tearing from his throat. Why? This. He gestured vaguely at his own neck, at the invisible mark that burned there. It was a logical necessity, Kalen said, his voice devoid of inflection. Your emerging heat cycle, combined with the containment failure, made you a liability. Your scent signature would have attracted unwanted attention. It would have led them to me, to you. The claim masks your signature. It declares you as mine, subordinate to my authority. In the eyes of the system and the instincts of other alphas, you are no longer a stray asset. You are property. It is the most effective form of camouflage. Property. The word landed with the finality of a closing door. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was property. He felt a wave of nausea, a dizzying sense of displacement. He had been moved from a corporate ledger to a personal one. He looked past Kalen, through the open door, and saw another vast window in the main living area. More city, more lights, more space than he could possibly comprehend. His breath hitched. The air was too thin. The room was too big. The sounds were too loud. The sheer overwhelming scale of the world pressed in on him. His conditioning, his entire life, had been a preparation for a small, white, silent box. This was the opposite. This was everything. His knees gave way. He slid down the wall, curling into a tight ball on the floor, pressing his forehead against his knees. He was trembling, a violent, uncontrollable shiver. The sensory input was a tidal wave, and he was drowning. The sounds, the sights, the smells, the texture of the air itself. It was all too much. A low keen escaped his lips, a sound of pure animal distress. He was breaking. The asset was failing. The property was defective. He waited for the cold voice, the command to stabilize, the sting of a chemical corrective. Instead, there was silence. A heavy, weighted silence. Then, a subtle shift in the air. The scent of winter and steel intensified, but it was different now. It was softer, less of a command, and more of a blanket. Kalen had moved to stand over him. Elian could feel the heat radiating from his body. He did not speak. He did not touch him. He simply stood there, a bastion of stillness in Elian's storm, and exuded his scent. It was a conscious act of control, a deliberate projection of calm and authority through their new bond. The alpha scent washed over Elian's frayed nerves, not suppressing his panic, but containing it, giving it shape. It was the most intimate, terrifying, and comforting thing he had ever experienced. He was a prisoner, but his jailer was holding the walls of his collapsing mind together. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He stayed curled on the floor, shaking in the shadow of the man who owned him, breathing in the scent of his gilded cage. Kalen watched the Omega crumble. It was a predictable outcome. The diagnostic term was environmental transition shock. 0734, Ilian, had been raised in a state of perpetual sensory nullification. His neural pathways were not equipped to process this level of raw data. The city, the space, the freedom. It was a form of torture for him. Kalen had anticipated this. He had protocols in mind: gradual desensitization, mild sedatives, controlled environmental exposure. But the raw, unfiltered distress radiating from the boy on the floor. It bypassed his logic. It registered not as a problem to be solved, but as a physical pain in his own chest. A sharp, uncomfortable ache. The bond. It was a conduit, a two-way street. He was not merely observing the asset's malfunction. He was experiencing a low-fidelity echo of it. He had not anticipated the intimacy of the feedback. His own training, his entire life, had been an exercise in emotional and instinctual suppression. He was a product of the very system he administered. Alphas in leadership were conditioned from birth to view their instincts as a weakness, a volatile element to be mastered and controlled, deployed only as a tool of intimidation or authority. Emotion was a flaw in the code. Empathy was a security risk. Yet the shivering terror of the Omega on the floor was scraping away at decades of conditioning, like acid on metal. He consciously flattened his own emotional response, forcing his heart rate to slow, his breathing to deepen. He focused his intent, pushing a sense of calm, of stability, through the bond. You are secure. There is no threat. I am in control. It was the same technique he used to project authority in a tense negotiation, but the target was now a terrified boy, and the medium wasn't pheromonal projection, but a raw, psychic link. He felt the frantic edge of Elian's panic begin to soften, the violent trembling easing into a lesser tremor. The effect was immediate, potent, and deeply unsettling. This level of influence was absolute. It was a power he had not fully comprehended when he invoked Protocol 7. He had brought the asset here, to his private residence, because it was the most secure location he controlled. A fortress of solitude, unlisted in any public or corporate directory, shielded by layers of counter-surveillance and biometric security. No one knew he lived here. It was the one place his control was total. And now he had introduced the single most chaotic variable of his career into the heart of it. Elian was a disruption in every sense. His scent, even masked by Kalen's own, was a faint, sweet undertone that clung to the recycled air, a ghost of organic life in a sterile machine. His presence was a violation of the apartment's pristine emptiness. He was a piece of art that didn't match the decor, a song in the wrong key. Kalen turned and walked into the main living area, leaving Elian to recover. He needed distance. He went to the nutrient dispenser, a sleek black panel in the wall. He keyed in a standard hydration and protein sequence. The machine hummed, producing a small grey packet of nutrient paste and a bulb of purified water. Sustenance, efficient, devoid of pleasure. He had consumed the same meal 3 times a day for the last 15 years. He placed the items on the low slate grey table that was the room's only furniture, besides a severe, angular sofa. He looked at the meager offering. For the first time, it looked inadequate. The echo of Elian's sensory overload had made him hyper-aware of his own environment. He noticed the lack of texture, the monotony of the flavor, the absence of warmth. His mind flashed back to a memory, a deep-filed data point from his own childhood before the conditioning had taken full hold. A woman's hands, his mother's, breaking a piece of warm bread, the smell of yeast and heat, the rough texture of the crust, the soft, yielding interior. A memory of pure, inefficient, illogical sensation. A memory he had been taught to identify as a cognitive contaminant. He dismissed it with practiced ease, but the ghost of it remained. He returned to the bedroom doorway. Elian had pushed himself up and was now sitting with his back against the wall, his knees drawn to his chest. He looked fragile, a sketch of a person not yet fully rendered. His grey eyes were fixed on the nutrient packet on the table. "You require sustenance," Kalen stated. His voice was flat, but the words felt clumsy, insufficient. He was used to issuing commands, not offers of care. The role of protector was an ill-fitting garment. Elian didn't move. He simply stared at the packet. "It's grey," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The coloration is irrelevant. It contains the precise nutritional values required for your biology." In the sanctuary, everything was white, Elian said, not to Kalen, but to himself. The food, the walls, the clothes. They said it was the color of purity. "It is the color of absence," Kalen corrected him, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. "The absence of contaminants, the absence of stimuli, the absence of choice." He did not know why he had said that. It was a crack in his own facade, a moment of unsanctioned honesty. He saw a flicker of surprise in Elian's eyes. The boy was looking at him now, really looking at him, with a dawning, fearful curiosity. He was not just seeing a director, an alpha, a captor. He was seeing a man. And Kalen found he did not want to be seen. He retreated back to his disciplined silence. He sat on the edge of the sofa, a calculated distance from the table, and opened his own packet of nutrient paste. He squeezed the grey, viscous substance into his mouth. It was tasteless, functional. It was fuel. He watched as Elian, after a long, hesitant moment, uncurled himself. He moved with a slow, cautious grace, as if testing the gravity of this new world. He crept toward the table and picked up the water bulb, holding it in his hands, studying it. He then picked up the nutrient packet. He squeezed a small amount onto his fingertip and brought it to his lips, his tongue darting out to taste it. His expression was unreadable. It was likely the first flavor, however bland, he had ever experienced that was not part of a controlled nutritional profile. They consumed their meal in absolute silence. The only sounds were the soft hum of the building and the distant sigh of the city. But the silence was different from the manufactured quiet of the sanctuary. This silence was alive. It was filled with tension, with unspoken questions, with the humming, invisible thread of the bond that connected them. Kalen felt every breath the Omega took, every subtle shift in his posture. He was acutely, painfully aware of him. The asset was no longer a line on a screen or a figure behind plasteel. He was a presence, a warm, breathing, deeply disruptive presence in the center of Kalen's cold, ordered world. And the most illogical, terrifying part of it all was a small, quiet thought that surfaced, unbidden, from the depths of his conditioned mind. He is not safe enough here. The thought was irrational. This was the safest place in the world. But it wasn't a thought about physical security. It was an instinct, a primal possessive instinct to shield, to hide, to hoard. An instinct he was supposed to have mastered, to have erased. The asset was compromising the system, and the system was him. Days bled into one another, measured not by the synthetic daylight of the sanctuary, but by the slow, majestic crawl of the real sun across the city skyline. Kalen had programmed the apartment's environmental controls to mimic a natural diurnal cycle, a gradual desensitization protocol. For Elian, it was a terrifying miracle. He would spend hours sitting on the floor by the vast window, watching the sky shift from the bruised purple of dawn to the brilliant, aching blue of midday, to the fiery orange and soft rose of sunset. He had never known such colors existed. He had never known light could be warm. Kalen kept his distance. He worked from the black console in the main room, his back to Elian, his attention seemingly fixed on the streams of data flowing across the screen. He was dismantling his own life's work, erasing his connections to the now defunct Project Chimera, creating a new blank identity for himself and, by extension, for the Omega, who was now inextricably tied to him. He moved with the same cold efficiency as always, but Elian could feel the tension in him through the bond. It was a low, constant hum of tightly controlled stress. He was a man methodically cutting his own anchor ropes, preparing to drift into an unknown sea. Their interactions were minimal, functional. Kalen would procure sustenance, always the same grey nutrient paste, and they would consume it in silence. He showed Elian how to operate the sonic cleanser, the sleep couch, the water dispenser. The instructions were clear, concise, devoid of any personal inflection. He was a living user manual for Elian's new life. Yet, for all his cold detachment, his care was absolute. The apartment's temperature was always perfect. The air was always filtered. When Elian woke from nightmares, fractured, silent screams replaying the fall of the sanctuary, he would find the Alpha standing in the doorway of his room, a dark, silent sentinel, projecting a wave of calm through the bond until the tremors subsided. He never spoke. He never came closer, but he was always there. It was a strange, suffocating kind of safety. Elian was a bird in a gilded cage, and his keeper was meticulous, but the bars were still there. He began to explore the apartment, his confidence growing in small increments. He ran his fingers over the cool, smooth surface of the walls, the surprisingly soft texture of the sofa, the unyielding cold of the plasteel window. He was building a new sensory library, replacing the nullity of the sanctuary with these new, discrete sensations. One cycle, while Kalen was engrossed in his work, Elian found a small, unmarked panel in the wall of the main living area. He pressed it, his curiosity overriding his ingrained obedience. The panel slid open, revealing not a control interface or a storage unit, but a small, recessed space, a compartment. Inside, there was a single object, a small, smooth grey stone. It was a simple, worthless thing, a piece of the natural world. But in this sterile, manufactured environment, it was an anomaly. It was the only object in the entire apartment that served no function. It was rough to the touch, its surface pitted and uneven. It was real. He picked it up. It was cool and heavy in his palm. He turned it over and over, feeling its texture, its weight. It was a profound and beautiful thing. Why was it here? Why would a man like Kalen, a man who was the architect of function over form, keep such a useless object? He felt a faint, inquisitive pulse through the bond. a question directed at the Alpha. Kalen's head turned slowly, his eyes fixed on the stone in Elian's hand. For the first time, Elian saw a crack in his armor. A flicker of something raw, something vulnerable, crossed his face before it was ruthlessly suppressed. "Put it back." Kalen's voice was low, tight. It was not the flat command of a director. It was something else, something personal. Elian didn't move. He held the stone, his gaze locked with Kalen's. The silence stretched, thick with a new kind of tension. This was not about an asset and a handler. This was about a secret. "It is a memento," Kalen said finally, his voice strained. "From my recruitment assessment. The final test was a week of survival in the outer wastes. We were given nothing. I found that stone in a dry riverbed. It was a focal point, a piece of unchanging reality in a hostile environment, a tool for maintaining mental discipline." He was reciting a report, but the emotion beneath the words was a turbulent undercurrent. Elian looked from the stone to the man, a boy, alone in the wilderness, clinging to a rock to keep his mind from shattering. This perfect, controlled Alpha was built on a foundation of profound trauma. He was not a machine. He was a fortress built around a wound. In that moment, the bond between them shifted. It was no longer just a chain of ownership, a fragile thread of understanding, of empathy spooled out from Elian's heart. He felt a phantom echo of cold, of hunger, of a desperate loneliness that was not his own. It was Kalen's. He slowly, carefully placed the stone back in its recess and closed the panel. He did not speak. He did not need to. Kalen had turned back to his console, but his shoulders were rigid. He had revealed a part of himself, a private, unsanitized piece of data, and the exposure had unsettled him. The power dynamic in the room had subtly, irrevocably tilted. Elian was no longer just an object of Kalen's care. He was a witness to his keeper's humanity, and that made him dangerous. He was a mirror, and Kalen was beginning to see a reflection in it he did not recognize, a reflection he had spent his entire life trying to erase. The revelation of the stone created a new, delicate tension in the apartment. Kalen became even more withdrawn, his silence heavier, his presence more guarded. He had exposed a vulnerability, and his instinct was to reinforce the walls. He spent longer hours at the console, his focus absolute, the streams of code and data a refuge from the unsettling emotional currents in the room. He was building their escape, a digital ghost ship to carry them away from the wreckage of their former lives. But the work felt less like a solution and more like a desperate act of postponement. Elian, in turn, retreated into himself. The flicker of empathy he had felt for Kalen was terrifying. To feel his own burgeoning emotions was overwhelming enough. To feel the echoes of another's, especially the deep, repressed sorrow of his captor, was a burden he wasn't equipped to carry. He found himself drawn to the window, to the silent, impersonal beauty of the city. He watched the tiny, anonymous vehicles, the distant, silent figures in other towers, and felt a profound, aching loneliness. He was in the world, but not of it. He was a ghost haunting a stranger's life. One evening, as the sky bled into a deep, velvety indigo, Elian noticed a flashing light on Kalen's console. The Alpha had finally risen from his chair, his movements stiff, and retreated into his own room, the door sliding shut with a soft finality. Elian knew he shouldn't. He knew it was a transgression. But a desperate, reckless curiosity had taken root in him, a need to understand the architecture of his own cage. He crept toward the console. The screen was dark, but a single data port on its side pulsed with a soft cyan light. A portable datapad was connected to it, forgotten. His hands trembled as he disconnected it. The screen lit up in his palms. It was unlocked. Kalen's personal device, a repository of the man's mind. The file system was stark, logical, encrypted, but one folder on the primary directory was open. Its title was simple, clinical. Project Chimera, Final Iteration Assessment. 0734. His own designation. His blood ran cold. He tapped the file. It opened. And his world, the fragile new world he had just begun to map, shattered into a million pieces. It was not a simple assessment. It was everything. His genetic sequencing, a cold string of letters and numbers that defined his creation. His developmental charts, tracking his growth from a petri dish to a viable fetus in an artificial womb. His psychological conditioning parameters, the specific frequencies and phrases used to build the walls in his mind. He saw images, thermal scans of his own body, neurological maps of his brain, a photograph of himself as a small, pale child with wide, fearful eyes staring into the lens of a diagnostic camera. He was not born. He was designed. He was not raised. He was cultivated. The report detailed his purpose to be the perfect Omega. Docile, pure, with a scent signature scientifically calibrated for maximum pheromonal appeal to high-stratum alphas, yet with a psychology conditioned for absolute obedience and suppression of instinct. He was a weapon, a prize, a tool for forging political alliances, a perfect, beautiful bargaining chip. The sanctuary was not a home. It was a factory, and he was its sole, perfect product. He scrolled down, his vision blurring with tears he did not know he was capable of shedding. He reached the final entries, logged in the days before the fall. Subject 0734, exhibiting signs of spontaneous preheat cycle. Hormonal suppressants proving less effective. Scent signature becoming unstable. Recommendation: accelerated pairing protocol, or in the event of containment failure, immediate tactical purge. Asset is too volatile to be allowed to fall into rival hands. There it was, in cold black text, the order for his own death, his own non-existence, and then the final addendum, logged by Director Kalen. Recommendation for purge is strategically unsound. Asset's unique genetic markers represent a culmination of decades of research. Value is incalculable. In the event of containment failure, I will invoke Executive Protocol 7. Preservation is the primary directive. Preservation, not of a life, but of research, of an investment. Kalen hadn't saved him. He had saved a priceless object. The claim wasn't an act of desperate mercy. It was a corporate acquisition. The kindness, the protection, the silent vigil by his door. It was all just meticulous maintenance of valuable property. The thought was a physical agony. He felt a pain so sharp, so deep, it was as if his very soul were being torn in two. He was not a person. He was not an asset. He was a thing, a beautiful, carefully crafted thing that his owner had refused to see destroyed. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a sound of absolute desolation. He dropped the datapad. It clattered against the floor, the screen cracking. The noise was shockingly loud in the silent apartment. He sank to his knees, wrapping his arms around his chest, trying to hold himself together as the truth ripped him apart. The bond, that humming, constant connection to the alpha in the next room, flared. But this time, it was not Kalen projecting onto him. It was alien. He did not try to stop it. He couldn't. He let all of his pain, his betrayal, his shattered sense of self pour through the link. He wanted Kalen to feel it. He wanted the architect of his suffering to experience the agony of his creation. Let him feel this, he thought, a single, venomous, defiant prayer. Let him feel what he has made. The door to Kalen's room slid open with violent speed. He stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide with a shocked, raw emotion Elian had never seen before. He had felt it. He had felt everything. Kalen was in a state of sensory deprivation, a self-imposed isolation when the pain hit him. It was not physical. It was a psychic shrapnel bomb that detonated in the center of his mind, a wave of pure, distilled agony, so potent it drove the air from his lungs and brought him to his knees. It was a feeling of being unmade, of discovering your entire existence was a lie, a carefully constructed artifice. It was the pain of a soul discovering it was nothing more than a beautiful, hollow object. It was Elian's pain, and it was pouring into him through the bond, a torrent of liquid fire that seared away his composure, his discipline, his control. He was on his feet and through the door before he had a conscious thought. He saw the cracked datapad on the floor. He saw Elian curled into a ball, his body racked with silent, violent sobs. And he understood the truth, a tactical error of catastrophic proportions. He had left his weapon unsecured, and his prisoner had shot himself with it. The wave of self-loathing that followed was so intense it was nauseating. He took a step forward, then another. Elian flinched away from him, scrambling backward until he was pressed against the base of the window. His face was a mask of betrayal. His grey eyes, usually so wide and curious, were now narrowed slits of pure, incandescent hatred. "You knew," Elian whispered, his voice broken, sharp as shattered glass. "All of it. You knew what I was." Kalen stopped. The accusation hung in the air between them, irrefutable. There were no words, no justifications that could mitigate this. "Yes," he said. The admission was quiet, toneless, a simple statement of fact. Was I even given a name?" Elian asked, a desperate, childish question that was more painful than any scream. Or was Elian just another designation, a code for live specimen? "It was a name given to you by a junior sanitarian," Kalen replied, his voice a low, rough thing. He forced himself to meet Elian's gaze, to absorb the full force of his creation's despair. She was reprimanded for anthropomorphism. The designation was 0734. He delivered the facts with the cold precision of a scalpel, because it was the only way he knew how to communicate. But the clinical words were a cruelty, and he knew it. He could feel Elian's fragile hope shrivel and die. "You built me," Elian said, his voice gaining a strange, terrifying strength. "You designed me to be helpless, to be receptive. You made me to be claimed. Was this always the plan? For you to be the one to do it?" "No," Kalen said, the word immediate, forceful. Protocol 7 was a contingency of last resort, a field decision. The plan was for you to be assigned. Assigned. Another sterile word for a lifetime of servitude. He saw the distinction was meaningless to Elian, savior or intended master. The cage was the same. He felt an overwhelming, illogical urge to fix this, to erase the pain he was feeling, reflected back at him 1,000-fold from the boy. But his tools were logic, order, and control, and this was a problem of the heart, a territory for which he had no maps. He could not lie. The bond would betray him. He could not apologize. The words would be meaningless. All he had left was the brutal, unvarnished truth. "I was the director of a project I believed in," he began, his voice low and steady, forcing the words out into the charged air. "I believed we were creating order from chaos, that we were protecting omegas from the volatility of their own biology and alphas from their own base instincts. We sought to create stability, purity, a perfect symbiotic system where there was no pain, no conflict, no choice." He looked past Elian at the sprawling, chaotic city outside. "I believed that was a kindness. I see now that a cage, no matter how perfect, is still a cage." His own words surprised him. Where had they come from? This was dissent. This was heresy against the core programming of his entire life. It was the bond. Elian's agony was not just an emotional echo. It was a catalyst, a solvent dissolving the rigid ideology that had structured his reality. He was seeing the system through his victim's eyes. Elian was silent, his breathing ragged. He was listening. The hatred in his eyes was still there, but it was now mingled with a deep, bottomless sorrow. "It does not change what you are," Kalen continued, pressing on, a confession pouring from him now. "It does not change what I did. I chose to preserve the asset. That is what you were to me, an asset, the culmination of my life's work." He took a hesitant step closer. Elian tensed, but did not flee. "But you are no longer an asset to me. The bond, it does not transmit data. It transmits experience. I feel your fear of the world. I feel your wonder at the color of the sky. And I feel this agony, and it is intolerable." He stopped, standing a few feet from where Elian was huddled. He was exposed, vulnerable, stripped of his authority and his certainty. He was just a man, standing before the wreckage he had made. "I claimed you to save my work," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But now, I would destroy all of it to stop this pain in you." The confession hung in the air, raw and shocking. It was the truest thing he had ever said. The logic was gone. The pragmatism was gone. All that remained was a fierce, protective, terrifying instinct. The Omega was in pain. The pain had to stop. Elian stared at him, his tear-streaked face illuminated by the city lights. He saw the conflict in Kalen's eyes, the genuine torment. He saw a man as trapped by the system as he was, a man whose cage was made of ideology instead of chrome-white walls. The hatred in his heart did not vanish, but it made room for something else. A vast, desolate pity. They were two halves of a broken whole, a monster and his creation, both realizing the nature of their prison at the same time. The power dynamic had not just tilted, it had shattered. He was no longer a victim cowering before his captor. He was a judge, and his creator was pleading his case. And Elian, for the first time in his life, had the power to deliver a verdict. But he said nothing. He simply watched the man who owned him, the man who was now owned by his own guilt, and the silence that followed was the sound of an entire world coming undone. The confession left a vacuum in the apartment. The air, once thick with tension and unspoken truths, was now thin and sharp with exposed, agonizing honesty. Kalen retreated, not to his room, but to the far side of the living area, standing before the window with his back to Elian. He was a statue of black fabric and rigid posture, but through the bond, Elian could feel the chaotic storm raging within him. Shame, regret, and a terrifying, nascent possessiveness that had shed its logical justification and was now just a raw, primal force. He had admitted he would destroy his life's work to soothe Elian's pain, and in doing so, had revealed a truth even he hadn't fully grasped. Elian was now his life's work. The project had not ended. It had simply been redefined. Elian remained on the floor, the cold of the polished wood seeping into his bones. The storm of his own grief had passed, leaving behind a strange, desolate calm. The knowledge of his origins was a permanent part of him now, an unhealable wound. But Kaelin's confession had changed its shape. The cruelty had not been personal. It had been systemic. Kaelin was not a sadist. He was a zealot who had just lost his religion. This did not excuse him. It did not absolve him. But it made him comprehensible. It made him as much a victim of his own creation as Elian was. Hours passed in this silent tableau. The city outside moved on, its lights blinking, its traffic flowing, oblivious to the quiet apocalypse happening in the sterile apartment high above. Finally, the chime came. It was soft, discreet, but in the profound silence, it sounded like a gunshot. A red light began to pulse on the apartment's main door panel. An alert, a visitor. Kaelin's body went rigid. He turned from the window, his face a mask of cold, lethal focus. The internal conflict was gone, replaced by the instant, efficient calculation of a director facing a threat. "They found us," he said, his voice a low, flat whisper. Elian's blood froze. "Who?" "The council. My superiors," Kaelin said, his eyes scanning the room, assessing angles, exits. "They will have questions about the fall of the sanctuary, about the loss of their primary asset. They do not know I have you. They believe you were purged." He looked at Elian, his steel-grey eyes intense. "They are here for me. But if they find you, they will take you. And their methods of control will be far less restrained than mine." The implication was clear. He would be returned to a cell, drugged, controlled, used for the purpose for which he was designed. The fragile, terrifying freedom of this apartment, which had felt like a cage only moments before, suddenly seemed like a paradise lost. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his desolate calm. He did not want to go back. "What do we do?" Elian asked, his voice trembling. He pushed himself to his feet, his body still weak. Kaelin crossed the room to a seamless panel in the wall. He pressed his palm against it, and it slid open to reveal a small armory. Pulse rifles, concussion grenades, a sleek silver vibro blade, the tools of a high-level enforcer. He took out a compact black pistol. It looked like a natural extension of his hand. "This apartment is a registered dead zone. No active surveillance. They cannot see inside. They only know I am here. They will attempt a formal entry first. 2 agents, standard compliance team." He checked the charge on the pistol. "They will ask me to surrender for debriefing. I will refuse. Then they will breach." He was calm, utterly, terrifyingly calm. This was his world. Threat assessment, tactical response. This, he understood. He looked at Elian, his gaze clinical but protective. "Your room. The wall opposite the door is reinforced. Stay there. Stay low. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." Elian nodded, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt a strange, unwelcome surge of adrenaline. For his entire life, he had been passive, an object to be acted upon. Now, he was in the middle of a conflict, a participant, however minor. He started to move toward the bedroom, but stopped. He looked back at Kaelin, who was now standing by the main door, the pistol held loosely at his side, his body in a state of relaxed readiness. You won't let them take me?" Elian asked, the question a whisper. Kalen's eyes met his. The cold, calculating director was gone again, replaced by the man who had confessed his own undoing. A fierce, possessive light burned in his gaze. It was the look of an alpha defending his territory, defending his own. "I will not," he said, his voice a low vow. It was not a strategic assessment. It was a promise that superseded his duty, his loyalty, his very identity. He was choosing the asset over the system. He was choosing Elian over himself. The chime sounded again, more insistent this time. A voice, amplified and metallic, came from the door's speaker. "Director Kalen, this is Agent Var. By order of the Executive Council, you are to open this door and surrender for an immediate security debriefing. Acknowledge." Kalen did not move. He did not speak. He simply waited, a predator in the stillness. Elian hurried into the bedroom, his breath catching in his throat. He pressed his back against the far wall as Kalen had instructed, sliding down to the floor. He could hear his own blood rushing in his ears. The apartment, his sterile sanctuary and gilded cage, was about to become a battlefield. And the man who had imprisoned him was now his only shield against the world that had created them both. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. He drew his knees to his chest and waited for the violence to begin. A loud, metallic clang echoed from the other room, followed by the high-pitched whine of a plasma torch. They were breaching. Elian flinched, pressing himself harder against the wall. The sound was surgical, efficient, a prelude to the chaos he knew was coming. He could feel Kalen's state through the bond. It was a state of hyper-focused calm, a chilling stillness, like the air before a lightning strike. There was no fear, no anger, just pure, lethal intent. It was the mind of a weapon that had been unsheathed. The whine of the torch stopped, replaced by a heavy thud as a section of the door was blasted inward. Elian heard 2 sets of heavy footsteps enter the apartment. "Director," a calm, authoritative voice said. "Agent Var, this is an unsanctioned escalation. Comply, and the council will be lenient." There was no response from Kalen, only silence. Elian held his breath, his ears straining. He imagined the scene. The 2 agents in their black tactical armor, weapons raised, advancing into the minimalist space, and Kalen standing alone, a single pistol against 2 trained operatives. "No sign of the asset," the second agent's voice reported. "Scans are clean. He must have purged it during the evacuation." "Good," Var replied. "One less complication. Director, last chance. Stand down." The silence stretched for 1, 2, 3 heartbeats. Then, the sharp, concussive crack of Kalen's pistol firing twice. It was followed by the heavier thud of pulse rifles returning fire. The sound of plasma bolts searing the air and impacting against the apartment's walls was a visceral, terrifying shriek. A heavy body hit the floor. Elian squeezed his eyes shut, his hands flying to his ears. The sounds were brutal, intimate. This was not the sanitized violence of simulations. This was the sound of bodies breaking, of a fight to the death happening just a few meters away. He felt a sharp jolt of pain through the bond, a phantom echo of a searing heat along Kalen's left arm. He'd been hit. Elian's eyes flew open, his breath catching in his throat. He could feel the Alpha's response. Not pain, but a cold, analytical assessment of the injury, followed by a surge of focused adrenaline. He was ignoring it, pushing through it. Another pistol shot, a choked cry. The second body fell. Silence descended again, thick and heavy, smelling of ozone and burnt metal. Elian stayed frozen, his heart hammering. Was it over? Was Kalen? He heard a single set of footsteps, slow, measured. Kalen was still standing. A wave of dizzying, inexplicable relief washed over him. His captor, his jailer, was safe. The contradiction of the feeling made him nauseous. Then a new sound, the soft hiss of a hidden communication link. "Va, do you copy? Status report," a new, tinny voice asked from the other room. It was coming from one of the downed agent's comms. Elian heard Kalen move. He heard a soft grunt, the sound of a body being rolled over. "Agent Va is indisposed," Kalen's voice said, low and steady, into the comm link. "As is Agent Thorne. Send my regards to the council. Tell them their property is no longer for sale." There was a sharp crack as he crushed the comm unit under his heel. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. This was an open declaration of war. Kalen had not just disobeyed an order, he had eliminated the council's agents and declared his rebellion. He had chosen Elian, not just over his duty, but over his own life. The weight of that choice, of that sacrifice, was a crushing pressure on Elian's chest. He heard Kalen moving around the main room, the clink of metal, the soft rustle of fabric. He was preparing. For what? The next wave of agents? Escape? Elian forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling. He had to see. He crept to the bedroom door and peered around the edge. The living area was a scene of controlled destruction. The two agents lay motionless on the floor, their black armor scored with plasma burns. The far wall was blackened and melted in several places. Kalen stood in the middle of it all, his back to Elian. His left sleeve was burned away, revealing a nasty plasma graze along his forearm, the skin red and blistered. He was ignoring it, his attention focused on a duffel bag on the table, which he was methodically packing with ammunition, ration bars, and a medical kit. He was a man preparing for a journey, for flight. He seemed to feel Elian's gaze, his head turning slightly. His eyes met Elian's. The cold focus was still there, but underneath it was a deep, weary pain. "They will send a full tactical team next," he said, his voice flat. "They will not bother to knock. We have perhaps 10 minutes. He turned back to his packing. He was so efficient, so calm. But Elian could feel the truth through the bond. He was running a dozen scenarios, calculating probabilities, and every single one of them was bleak. They were trapped in a tower in the middle of a hostile city with the full force of a powerful clandestine organization about to descend upon them. A strange, defiant impulse rose up in Elian. He had been a victim. He had been an asset. He had been all property. He would not be a liability. He would not be dead weight. He stepped out of the bedroom, into the main room, his bare feet silent on the floor. He walked past the bodies of the agents without looking at them, his gaze fixed on Kalen. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice quiet but clear. Kalen stopped packing. He turned fully to face Elian, a flicker of surprise in his steel-grey eyes. He studied the Omega for a long moment. He saw the fear, the trauma, but he also saw a new, hard glint of resolve. The fragile glass object was showing seams of tempered steel. "There is a service conduit behind the nutrient dispenser," Kalen said after a moment, his voice accepting the unexpected offer. "It leads to the lower levels. It will be our only way out. The panel is magnetically sealed. It will require 2 people to pry it open." He was giving him a task, a role. He was treating him not as cargo, but as a partner. It was a small thing, but it was everything. Elian nodded, a surge of purpose cutting through his fear. He would not be saved. He would participate in his own survival. He followed Kalen to the nutrient dispenser, his eyes fixed on the alpha's back. The bond between them hummed, no longer a chain of ownership or a conduit of pain, but a lifeline in a rising storm. They were no longer a keeper and his prize. They were two fugitives, bound by a shared enemy and a desperate, unspoken need to protect each other. The battle for the apartment was over. The war for their lives had just begun. The final 10 minutes were a blur of silent, focused activity. Kalen worked the release mechanism on the service panel, while Elian packed a small, desperate bag of his own. 2 water bulbs and the grey nutrient packets Kalen had been providing. It felt absurd, packing for a journey into the unknown with the food of his imprisonment, but it was all he had, all he knew. He worked with a strange clarity, the terror sharpening his senses rather than dulling them. He could feel Kalen's urgency through the bond, a tightly coiled spring of controlled haste. There was no time for doubt, no space for the maelstrom of emotions that had defined their last few days. There was only the task, the escape, the next breath. With a final, groaning screech of metal, the panel came free. It revealed a dark, narrow shaft, thick with cables and conduits, dropping into blackness. The air that wafted out was cool and smelled of dust and ozone. It was the smell of the city's guts. "Go," Kalen commanded, his voice low. He slung the duffel bag over his shoulder, the pistol now secured in a thigh holster. "There are rungs on the left wall. The descent is 50 meters to the primary utility corridor. Move quickly. Do not look down." Elian nodded. He swung his legs into the shaft, his hands finding the cold, grimy metal of the rungs. He paused for a fraction of a second, his body suspended over the abyss. He looked back at Kalen. The alpha's face was grim in the dim light, his eyes fixed on Elian, a silent, intense pressure of encouragement. In that moment, Elian saw the terrifying depth of Kalen's gamble. He had thrown away a lifetime of power, of prestige, of belief, all for this, for him. The weight of it was immense, but it was also a strange, fierce source of strength. He was worth this. He had to be. He began to climb down, his movements clumsy at first, then more certain. The darkness swallowed him. The only reality was the cold metal under his hands and feet, and the steady, reassuring presence of Kalen descending above him, a guardian at his back. They moved in silence, the only sounds their breathing and the soft scrape of their shoes against the rungs. They had descended perhaps 30 meters when they heard it, a series of heavy, percussive thuds from above. The tactical team. They were blasting their way into the apartment. A moment later, a new sound, the high-pitched, terrifying whine of scanners sweeping the building. "They'll find the open conduit," Kalen's voice came from above, calm and low. Faster. Elian's fear gave his muscles new strength. He moved quicker, his hands and feet finding their rhythm in the darkness. He could feel Kalen's mind working, calculating, processing the new threat. The calm exterior was a lie. Inside, the Alpha was a whirlwind of tactical analysis, but beneath that was a simple, primal directive: protect the Omega. It pulsed through the bond, a steady, drumming beat. They reached the bottom of the shaft, dropping into a wide, dimly lit corridor. Pipes and cables lined the walls, and the air was thick with the hum of the building's life support systems. It was a place no resident of the gleaming tower above would ever see. It was a place to hide. "This way," Kalen said, his voice barely a whisper. He took the lead, moving with a silent, predatory grace through the labyrinth of machinery. Elian followed close behind, his eyes darting into the shadows. The sense of being hunted was a physical weight on his shoulders. They wound their way through the service levels for what felt like an eternity, the silence broken only by the distant, muffled sounds of the city's machinery. Kalen seemed to have a map in his head, navigating the identical corridors with an unerring sense of direction. Finally, he stopped at a heavy, reinforced door marked with a biohazard symbol. "Waste disposal chute," he explained quietly. "It leads to the Undercity's primary reclamation center. It's automated. They won't be monitoring it closely." He began to work at the door's electronic lock, pulling a small device from his bag and interfacing with the panel. As he worked, Elian leaned against the cool metal wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. They had escaped the apartment, but they were still trapped in the tower, a massive, vertical prison. He looked at Kalen's back, at the focused tension in his shoulders. The man was a machine of survival, his every action precise and purposeful. But Elian could feel the strain, the cost of his rebellion. The plasma burn on his arm must have been agony, but he gave no sign of it. The weight of their future was entirely on him. The lock clicked open. Kalen pushed the heavy door inward, revealing a large, cylindrical tube that descended at a steep angle into darkness. The roar of powerful fans echoed from below. "It's a gravity chute," Kalen said. "The fall will be unpleasant, but it will take us out of the building's primary sensor grid." He looked at Elian, his expression unreadable. "There is no other way." Elian stared into the black maw of the chute. It looked like a throat waiting to swallow him whole. His ingrained fear of the unknown, of uncontrolled spaces, screamed at him to retreat. But then he looked at Kalen, at the man who had burned his own world down for him. Fear was a luxury he could no longer afford. He gave a single, sharp nod. Kalen went first, disappearing into the darkness without hesitation. A moment later, Elian followed. The fall was terrifying, a stomach-lurching, disorienting plunge through a roaring, pitch-black tube. He tumbled through the darkness, his body weightless and helpless. He squeezed his eyes shut and clung to the one anchor he had, the steady, reassuring presence of the Alpha at the other end of the bond. It was a beacon in the chaos, a point of stillness in the dizzying fall. "I am here. You are safe." They were spat out onto a massive, moving conveyor belt amidst a mountain of the city's refuse. The stench was overwhelming, a thick, cloying miasma of decay and chemicals. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of grinding gears, hissing steam, and crashing metal. For a moment, Elian lay there, stunned, his senses overloaded by this new, brutal reality. This was the Undercity, the filthy, chaotic foundation upon which the gleaming towers were built. Kalen was already on his feet, pulling Elian up from the moving river of trash. He was covered in grime, his black clothes streaked with filth, but his eyes were sharp, alert. He had already assessed their new environment, identified the threats and the exits. He pulled Elian along, half dragging him off the conveyor belt and onto a rusted metal walkway. They found shelter in the shadow of a massive, groaning incinerator. The heat from it was a comforting warmth in the damp, cold air. They were out. They were free. But they were in a new kind of hell. Elian sank to the floor, his body trembling with exhaustion and shock. Kalen stood over him, a silent guardian, his pistol in his hand, his eyes scanning the cavernous, shadowy space of the reclamation center. Elian looked up at him. This man of sterile rooms and perfect order, now standing in the heart of filth and chaos, he had done this for him. Kalen looked down, his gaze meeting Elian's. The steel in his eyes had softened, just slightly. The possessiveness was still there, but it was mingled with a fierce, weary tenderness. He had claimed Elian to save him from the system. He had succeeded, but now he had to save him from the world. He crouched down in front of Elian, his movements slow, deliberate. He reached out, not with a command, not with a restraint, but with a surprising gentleness. He brushed a piece of filth from Elian's cheek with his thumb. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it was the first time Kalen had touched him without a functional purpose. It was a gesture of simple, human connection. "I will not let them find you," Kalen said, his voice a low, rough promise in the din of the machinery. "I will not let anyone harm you." Elian looked into the eyes of his savior, his captor, his partner. He was free from the sanctuary, but he was more deeply bound than ever before, bound to this fallen director, this reluctant alpha, this man who had refused to let him be purged. And now, Elian knew, with a terrifying certainty, he would never, ever let him go. The undercity air was toxic. The future was a terrifying unknown. But in that moment, huddled in the grime and shadows, Elian felt the first, fragile, impossible flicker of hope. Their journey was not over. It had just begun.